You know what really kills me? Rich people trying to buy peace of mind. They spend 50 years stepping on necks to get to the penthouse. Then their cardiologist tells them to go look at a tree so they don't drop dead. It's all so phony. I'm Charlotte Bradley. 8 years ago, my parents wrote me a severance check and kicked me out into the rain because I wanted to grow flowers instead of portfolios. They said I was a waste of a last name. But today, they're on the VIP list to visit the empire I built. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spend here with us. Now watch me bury their egos in the dirt. The heat inside a compost pile is surprising if you've never stuck your hand in one. It isn't a lukewarm warmth, it is a living, breathing heat, steaming at 140 degrees, even when the city pavement outside is frozen solid. I pulled my glove off and pressed my bare palm into the dark, crumbling matter. It smelled rich like damp forest floors and coffee grounds. To most people walking past the wrought iron gates of the commons, this was just a pile of rotting waste. To me, it was the engine. It was the only reason the tulips in the South Garden were currently rioting in shades of crimson and gold, and why the Japanese maples by the pond hadn't died during last summer's drought. Temperature is good, Charlotte. A voice rasped behind me. I stood up, wiping my hand on my canvas overalls. Mr. Abernathy, one of my Tuesday regulars, was leaning on a rake. He was 85, wore a tweed vest that had seen better decades, and possessed a work ethic that put the 20-year-old interns to shame. "If it stays this hot, we can turn it on Thursday," I said, checking the thermometer again. "How are the hydrangeas looking?" "Thirsty," he grunted, "like everything else in this city." I smiled and picked up my wheelbarrow. From where we stood in the working sector of the garden, I could see the skyline. Glass and steel towers loomed over our 3 acres of green, looking down on us like judgment. The Commons was famous now. Architectural Digest had called it an urban miracle, and the city council liked to bring foreign dignitaries here to show off their commitment to sustainability. They shook my hand when cameras were rolling, praising my vision. But they didn't know me. To the board of directors, I was Charlotte Bradley, the landscape architect, a success story. To the soil, I was just another pair of hands. I preferred the soil's opinion. I wheeled the barrow toward the tool shed, keeping my head down, as a black Mercedes rolled slowly into the VIP lot near the east gate. My stomach tightened, a reflex I couldn't unlearn. It was a physical phantom weight, a heaviness in my chest that appeared whenever I saw German luxury cars or polished Italian leather shoes. It was the feeling of not being enough. I parked the barrow and began scrubbing the dirt from my nails at the outdoor sink. A woman walked past on the public path, flanked by 2 bodyguards. She was a donor, probably someone here to see her name on a plaque. As she passed, the wind shifted. It hit me before I saw her. A heavy floral perfume. Gardenia masked by something sharp and chemical. I froze, the water running cold over my wrists. The smell didn't belong in the garden. It belonged in a sterile dining room 8 years ago. The memory didn't wash over me. It dragged me under. I was 21 again. The air conditioning in the restaurant was set to a temperature that felt designed to preserve meat. It was my brother's graduation dinner. He was sitting to my right, glowing in the reflection of his new Rolex, a gift for finishing med school. I was sitting across from my father, Richard. He was cutting his steak with surgical precision, the knife scraping against the porcelain. That sound was the only noise in the room. I'm waiting for the punchline, Charlotte, he said. He didn't look up from his plate. It's not a joke, I said, my voice sounding very small in the cavernous room. I withdrew from the MBA program this morning. I got an internship at the Arboretum. It's what I want to do, Dad. I want to work with the land. My mother, Eleanor, sighed. It was a soft, tragic sound, as if I'd just announced a terminal illness. She lifted her wineglass, the heavy scent of her gardenia perfume wafting across the table, choking out the smell of the food. She took a sip, refusing to meet my eyes. She was looking at the waiter, at the wall, at her diamond bracelet, anywhere but at her disappointment. Richard finally set his knife down. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and placed it on the table. We are Bradleys, he said. His voice was quiet, calm, and absolutely lethal. Bradleys build hospitals. We build firms. We do not dig holes in the mud like peasants. It's landscape architecture, I tried to argue. It's valid. It is a hobby, he interrupted. And we do not support hobbies. We support careers. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook. The leather crackled as he opened it. He uncapped his fountain pen gold heavy and wrote quickly. He tore the check out with a sharp zip and slid it across the white tablecloth. $5,000, he said. Consider it a severance package from this family. If you want to play in the dirt, Charlotte, you can do it without our last name. And without our money. I looked at the check. I looked at my brother, who was suddenly very interested in his salad. I looked at my mother, who was signaling the waiter for more Pinot Noir. Mom, I whispered. She didn't blink. You've upset your father, Charlotte. Don't make a scene. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, but they didn't flinch. I didn't take the check. I left it sitting there, a small blue slip of paper next to the butter dish. I walked out the heavy oak doors and into the night. It had started to rain, a freezing November sleet that bit through the thin silk of the dress I had worn just to please them. I stood on the curb, shivering, waiting for the valet to bring my beat-up Honda, realizing that the cold soaking into my bones was the warmest thing I had felt all night. Charlotte, the voice snapped me back to the present. I gasped, pulling my hands out of the sink. The water was still running. Maya, my assistant, was standing there with a clipboard looking concerned. You okay? You were staring at the soap like it offended you. I'm fine, I said, my voice raspy. I turned off the tap and shook my hands dry. Just thinking about invasive weeds. What do you have? Maya tapped the clipboard. The wellness walk. The cardiologist group sent over the VIP list for the 2:00 p.m. tour. These are the high-stress executives the doctors prescribe nature therapy to. She rolled her eyes good-naturedly. Basically, a bunch of rich folks who need to be told that trees are good for them. She handed me the list. The guide called in sick, so I need to know if you want me to cancel it or if you want to assign it to one of the interns. I scanned the names, mostly looking for donors I needed to avoid. Johnston, Vanderbilt, Kowalski, and then near the bottom typed in standard Arial font, Mr. Richard Bradley and Mrs. Eleanor Bradley. My breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. They were here, or they would be in 20 minutes. The parents who hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't checked to see if I was alive for 8 years were coming to my sanctuary, because their doctor told them their hearts were failing from the stress of the life they chose. Charlotte, Maya asked, should I cancel? I looked down at myself. My boots were caked in dry mud. My overalls were stained green at the knees. My hair was pulled back in a messy braid tucked under a frayed sun hat. My hands, my strong, capable hands, were rough and stained with walnut oil. I looked nothing like the girl in the silk dress. I looked nothing like a Bradley. No, I said, a strange calm settling over me. I reached for the clipboard. Don't assign the intern, I said, pulling my hat brim down lower over my eyes. I'll take them. You, Maya looked at my clothes. You want to lead a VIP tour dressed like that? Yes, I said. They're here to see nature, Maya. I'm just part of the landscape. I turned toward the welcome center, my boots crunching on the gravel. I wasn't running away this time. If they wanted to see the dirt, I would show them exactly what grew from it. I stood by the wrought iron archway of the east gate waiting. The gravel path under my boots was a specific blend. I had designed myself crushed local granite mixed with permeable bonding agents to prevent runoff. It was functional, sustainable, and quiet. But the vehicle approaching the gate was none of those things. The black sedan purred like a predator. It was an S-Class, sleek and polished to a mirror shine that reflected the distorted image of the cherry trees above it. It didn't just drive. It prowled. It stopped exactly 3 inches from the "No vehicles beyond this point" sign, the engine idling with a low, aggressive rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I adjusted my hat. It was a wide-brimmed straw utility hat, frayed at the edges and stained with the residue of 1,000 rainy mornings. I pulled it down until the world narrowed to a slit of visibility. I checked my hands. No rings, no watch, just short nails and skin, etched with the fine lines of manual labor. I was invisible. I was part of the infrastructure. The driver's door opened first. A hired man in a suit stepped out, circling the car to open the rear passenger door. And there they were. Memory is a tricky architect. It tends to build monsters out of men. For 8 years, I had remembered Richard Bradley as a titan, 6 feet of iron will and terrifying competence. I remembered Eleanor as a porcelain statue, flawless and unreachable. But the man who stepped onto the granite path was not a titan. He was an old man. His posture, once militarily rigid, was slumped forward as if gravity had finally decided to collect a debt. His face was gray, the skin hanging loosely around the jawline, his eyes darting around the garden with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. He was clutching a smartphone in one hand and rubbing his sternum with the other. Eleanor followed. She looked thinner, brittle. Her designer slacks were perfectly pressed, but her movements were jerky. She was gripping her handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. They looked rich, they looked powerful, and they looked absolutely miserable. I forced my breathing to slow. Inhale the loam, exhale the exhaust. I stepped forward, keeping my head bowed slightly, adopting the posture of service I knew they expected. "Mr. and Mrs. Bradley," I asked. My voice was lower than usual, roughened by a morning of shouting orders over the wood chipper. Richard didn't look at my face. He looked at his watch. "We're on a schedule. The confirmation said 2 o'clock. It is 2:01. "My apologies," I said. "Welcome to the Commons. I'll be leading your wellness walk today." Richard made a noise in his throat, a dismissive grunt I remembered from 1,000 dinner table lectures. He looked around the entrance, his eyes landing on the compost bins, visible through the slat fence. He wrinkled his nose. "This is it?" he asked, turning to Eleanor. Dr. Evans said this was a sanctuary. It looks like a construction site. It's organic, Richard, Eleanor said, though her tone suggested she found the word distasteful. She looked down at her shoes, Italian leather loafers with a terrified expression. I don't see why we couldn't just go to the spa at the Mandarin. At least they have paved floors. She took a step and winced as a piece of gravel crunched beneath her sole. Here, Richard said, snapping his fingers at me. I looked up careful to keep my eyes shadowed by the brim. He was shrugging out of his overcoat. It was camel hair, immaculate, likely costing more than the annual budget for my seed supply. He held it out, not checking to see if I was ready to receive it. He just assumed a hand would be there. Take this, he commanded, and be careful. It's cashmere. Don't drape it over a fence post or whatever you people do. Put it in a locker. I took the coat. It was heavy and warm-smelling of dry cleaning chemicals and the stale metallic scent of stress. For a second, just a split second, I wanted to drop it in the mud. I wanted to let the wet earth ruin the perfection he prized so highly. Instead, I draped it over my arm. I'll have this secured in the welcome center for you, I said softly. If you'll follow me, the sensory beds are this way. Don't get mud on your cuffs, Richard, Eleanor warned, clutching his arm. They walked past me, leaving a wake of expensive cologne and anxiety. They didn't even glance at the name tag clipped to my overalls. It didn't matter. They wouldn't have recognized the woman beneath the dirt anyway. The transition from the city grid to the interior of the commons was designed to be jarring. I had worked with an acoustical engineer to build Berm's artificial hills of earth planted with dense conifers that acted as a sound shield. Within 20 paces, the roar of the metro traffic vanished, replaced by the low hum of bees and the sound of wind moving through ornamental grasses. I led them to the start of the sensory beds. This was my pride and joy, a winding path flanked by plants chosen specifically for their neurochemical impact. Richard was typing a furious email on his phone as he walked. Eleanor was inspecting a leaf with suspicion, as if checking for dust. The soil here, I began pitching my voice to be soothing but authoritative, is cultivated to be rich in Mycobacterium vaccae. Richard stopped typing. He looked up annoyed. Micro? What is that, a bacteria? Is it sanitary? It's a soil bacterium, I explained, keeping my stride slow. When inhaled or touched, it stimulates neurons in the brain to produce serotonin. It literally functions like a mild antidepressant. That's why Dr. Evans prescribes these walks. Just breathing the air here lowers cortisol levels by 18% within 20 minutes. Richard scoffed, though he did slip his phone into his pocket. 18% sounds like marketing fluff. It's peer-reviewed data, I said simply. We measure it. Eleanor asked. She was looking at me now, or rather, at my dirty boots. You sound very informed for a groundskeeper. I listen to the experts, I lied. We have a very demanding founder. Well, Richard said, looking at a sprawling bed of lavender and sage. It's certainly quiet. I'll give you that, though I imagine the upkeep is a nightmare. What's the ROI on a place like this? It's prime real estate. You could put a 40-story condo here and make a killing. The return on investment, I said, crouching down to snap a dead head off a purple coneflower, is that people don't have strokes. Richard stiffened. He rubbed his chest again, a subconscious tic. Cute, but health is a personal responsibility, not a municipal charity. I stood up, wiping my hands on my thighs. The tension was bubbling up a hot spring, searching for a crack in the rock. I needed to push just a little. I needed to know if the last decade had taught them anything at all. "Do you have a garden at home?" I asked. "God, no," Eleanor laughed. It was a brittle, sharp sound. "We have landscapers. They come on Tuesdays. Green things are messy. They attract insects." "And children," I asked. "Do you have children who enjoy the outdoors?" The silence that followed was heavy. A cloud passed over the sun, dimming the vibrant greens of the ferns around us. Richard looked at a Japanese maple, his jaw working. "We had a daughter," he said. The past tense hit me like a physical blow. Had, as if I were dead. "I'm sorry," I said, and the tremor in my voice was real. "Did she pass away?" "She might as well have," Richard spat. The bitterness in his tone was toxic. "She walked out, quit a prestigious MBA program to go play in the dirt, just like this. Squandered every opportunity we gave her. We handed her a golden ticket and she threw it in the trash to be a laborer. She had no vision." Eleanor added, her voice quieter, sadder. "We wanted so much for her. We wanted her to be secure, to be someone." I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, hidden by the shadow of my hat. "Maybe she wanted to be happy," I suggested. "Maybe she found security in her own way." Eleanor turned to me, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce condescension. "Happy," she repeated, the word tasting sour in her mouth. "Let me tell you something, young lady. Happy doesn't pay for a summer house in the Hamptons. Happy doesn't get your name on the hospital wing. Success is measurable. It is tangible." She gestured vaguely at the stunning canopy of weeping willows ahead of us, trees I had planted as saplings with my own money when I was eating ramen noodles in a studio apartment. "This," she said, waving a manicured hand at my life's work, "this is charming. It's quaint, but it's charity. It's not a business. It's not a legacy. My daughter chose to be a nobody, and I suppose that's what she is now. Probably a florist's assistant somewhere, struggling to pay rent with dirt under her fingernails, just like yours." I looked down at my hands. The dirt under my nails was indeed there, but it wasn't shame. It was graphite and nitrogen and life. "I see," I said. My voice was steady now, cold. "It sounds like you have a very specific definition of value." "Value is what you leave behind," Richard said firmly. "It's the structure you build that lasts." "Then you'll want to see the pavilion," I said. I turned on my heel, gesturing for them to follow. "The pavilion?" Richard asked, checking his watch again. "Is there a place to sit? My back is killing me." "Yes," I said. "It's the heart of the garden. It's where we honor the people who made this place possible, the people who understood what it takes to actually build something that lasts." I led them down the path, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. We were walking toward the Founder's Circle. We were walking toward the truth. They followed me, complaining about the humidity, complaining about the uneven ground, completely unaware that they were walking into the cathedral of the very person they claimed didn't exist. "It's just ahead," I said. "I think you'll find the architecture enlightening." Richard grunted. "I doubt it, but if there's a bench, I'll take it." I smiled beneath my hat. "Oh, there's a bench," I whispered to myself. "And wait until you see whose name is on it." The Legacy Pavilion was not a building in the traditional sense. It was a cathedral of living architecture formed by 60-year-old weeping willows that had been trained, grafted, and guided over decades to weave their branches into a vaulted ceiling. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in dappled shifting patterns, creating a mosaic of gold and green on the flagstone floor. It was the masterpiece of the commons. It was also undeniably expensive looking. As we stepped into the cool shade, the change in Richard was immediate. The scowl of discomfort vanished, replaced by the calculating squint of an appraiser. He walked to one of the structural trunks, tapping it with his knuckle as if testing for rot. He looked up at the woven canopy, calculating the engineering required to keep it standing. "Now this," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the organic chamber. "This is impressive. This is deliberate." Eleanor smoothed her skirt, looking relieved to be out of the direct sun. "It's very European, isn't it? Like something from the Tuileries, much better than those messy bushes outside." Richard turned to me, his demeanor shifting from annoyed patron to potential investor. He pulled a business card from his pocket, heavy stock gold foil embossing. "You said you work for the founder," he said, extending the card. "I want an introduction. We need to talk about sponsorship. This structure has potential, but the grounds are a mess. We could pave the approach, put in some proper statuary, maybe a bronze fountain. Get rid of those weeds you call native species. If the price is right, we could discuss a naming rights endowment. The Bradley Pavilion has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" I stared at the card. Richard Bradley, senior partner, Bradley Holt and Associates. The little white rectangle represented everything he valued: status, control, the ability to slap a label on something beautiful and claim he made it. I didn't take the card. "You can't buy a wing here, Richard," I said. My voice was no longer the soft, subservient murmur of a guide. It was hard, flat, and absolute. Richard frowned, his hand still extended. "Excuse me. Everything is for sale, young lady. It's just a matter of the donation size. Now, go get your boss. I'm done walking." "And you can't fix the weeds." "Eleanor," I continued, turning to my mother, "because they aren't weeds. They are goldenrod and milkweed. They feed the monarchs. They belong here, unlike the fountain you want to build." Richard's face reddened. The insolence of the help was confusing him. "I don't think you understand who you are speaking to. I asked you a direct question. Who runs this place?" I reached up and grabbed the brim of my hat. "I do." I pulled the hat off and dropped it onto the flagstones. It landed with a soft slap. I shook my head, letting my hair fall loose from the messy braid. I took a step forward out of the shadows of the willow branches and into a shaft of unfiltered sunlight. I stood up straight, shedding the slouch I had adopted at the gate, expanding to my full height. I looked Richard Bradley directly in the eyes. "I run this place," I said. "I designed it, I built it, and I own the land." The silence that descended on the pavilion was heavier than the humidity. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. Richard stared. His brain was misfiring, trying to overlay the image of the daughter he had disowned 8 years ago onto the woman standing before him in dirt-stained overalls. He squinted, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Eleanor was the first to break. She took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her throat, clutching her pearls as if they were a lifeline. Her eyes went wide, glassy with shock. "Charlotte," she whispered. It came out as a question, terrified and hopeful all at once. Richard flinched. The name seemed to physically strike him. He looked at Eleanor, then back at me, his gaze raking over my face, my eyes, my jawline, the scar on my chin from a childhood bike accident. "No," he said. It was a reflex, a denial of reality. She's gone. She left. I didn't leave, I said, stepping closer. I was evicted. There's a difference. Richard's face went from gray to a mottled, angry red. The shock was metabolizing into rage, the specific rage of a narcissist who has been caught off guard. This is a joke, he snapped. He looked around as if expecting a camera crew. Is this some kind of stunt? You're the gardener. You were hauling dirt. I am the gardener, I agreed. That's the job, Dad. That's the work you said was beneath us. You cannot own this, he sputtered, gesturing wildly at the sprawling park around us. This is prime city real estate. This is a multi-million-dollar project. You had nothing. I gave you $5,000 and you walked away. You cannot build this with $5,000. You're right, I said. I couldn't. I burned through your check in 3 months on rent and a business license. Then who? He sneered, regaining his footing. Who is backing you? Who are you fronting for? Did you marry money? Did you con some investor? I had investors, I said calmly, silent partners, people who actually believed in the concept of growth. People who understood that you don't cut down a sapling just because it isn't a mahogany tree yet. I pointed to the center of the pavilion. Directly behind Richard, anchored into the earth, was a massive block of rough-hewn granite. It served as the central bench of the cathedral. Embedded in the stone was a bronze plaque polished to a warm glow. Read it, I commanded. Richard didn't move. He was staring at me with a mixture of fury and confusion. Read the plaque, Richard, I said, my voice echoing off the willow wood. He turned slowly. He approached the stone like it might bite him. Eleanor drifted behind him, peering over his shoulder. I watched their eyes scan the metal text. I knew the words by heart. I had written them in my sketchbook the night I slept in my car after the eviction. The Commons dedicated to the memory of Arthur and Rose Bradley, who taught me that the mightiest oaks start in the messiest dirt. I saw Richard's shoulders seize. He went rigid as if an electric current had just surged through the soles of his Italian loafers. Arthur and Rose, his parents, my grandparents, the people Richard had spent 50 years trying to erase. He had changed his accent, changed his clothes, and moved to the city to bury the fact that he was the son of a pig farmer and a school teacher from rural Ohio. He hated them. He hated their poverty, their dirt, their simplicity. He had refused to let us visit them more than once a year. This, Richard choked. He spun around, his eyes wild. You dedicated this place to them? They were the only Bradleys who invested in me, I said. I walked over to the bench and ran my hand along the cool bronze. You cut me off, Dad. You closed the accounts. You told everyone I was dead to you. But Grandma Rose, she wrote me a letter every month, and inside every letter she folded a $20 bill or a 50, or whatever she had saved from selling eggs. I looked at Eleanor. She was weeping silently, tears tracking through her foundation. I didn't use that money for rent, I said. I bought seeds. I bought trays. I started growing seedlings in my apartment bathtub. I sold them at the farmer's market. Then I bought a greenhouse lease. Then I bid on this derelict lot when the city condemned it. I turned back to Richard. He looked sick. He looked like a man who had just swallowed poison. You told me that digging holes was for peasants, I said, letting the anger finally bleed into my voice. You told me that if I wanted to play in the dirt, I had to do it without your name. Well, I didn't use your name. I used theirs. They were nobodies, Richard shouted, his voice cracking. They lived in filth. I worked my entire life to get us out of the mud, to get us into boardrooms, to give you a clean life. And you drag us back down. You build a shrine to poverty in the middle of the city. It's not a shrine to poverty, I shot back. It's a shrine to life. Look around you, Richard. Look at the people outside. I gestured to the open arches of the pavilion. Beyond the willows, the garden was full. A young mother was reading to her child. Two businessmen were eating sandwiches on a rock. A group of teenagers was laughing near the pond. This isn't filth, I said. This is peace. This is the only place in the city where people can breathe. And the elite, the people you so desperately want to impress, they love it here. The mayor is a regular. The governor had his re-election party on the South Lawn. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space, smelling the sour tang of his fear. You wanted a legacy? You wanted a wing named after you. You're standing in it. But it's not named after the Bradley who made the money. It's named after the Bradleys who made the soil. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked at the plaque, then at the weeds, then at me. The cognitive dissonance was breaking him. The thing he despised, the dirt, was the source of the power he craved. And the daughter he called a failure was the one holding the keys. You're lying, he whispered, weak and desperate. You're lying about the money. You must have. Grandma Rose left me the farm when she died. I said, delivering the final blow. You didn't know, because you didn't go to the funeral. You were too busy with the merger. Richard flinched. I sold the farm, I said softly. I sold the land you grew up on, and I used every penny to buy the concrete you're standing on and break it apart. I used their legacy to undo yours. Eleanor let out a sob, a raw, ugly sound that echoed in the cathedral. She slumped onto the stone bench, sitting right next to the name of the mother-in-law she had looked down on for 30 years. Charlotte, she cried, covering her face with her hands. Oh, God, what have we done? Richard didn't sit. He stood trembling, vibrating with a mixture of humiliation and fury. He looked at me with eyes that no longer saw a daughter, but an enemy who had outmaneuvered him. You think you're smart, he hissed. You think this is some kind of victory? You're just a gardener with a grudge? I'm not the one with the grudge. Dad, I said, crossing my arms, I'm the one with the garden. You're just a guest, and right now you're trespassing. My declaration hung in the air, suspended in the silence of the Willow Cathedral. Trespassing, Richard repeated. The word seemed to stick in his throat, a foreign object he couldn't swallow. He looked around the pavilion, his eyes darting from the vaulted ceiling of living branches to the stone floor, desperate to find a flaw, a crack, anything that would allow him to dismiss the reality of what I had built. He laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, rattling bark, the sound of an engine trying to turn over without oil. Trespassing, he said again, shaking his head as he paced a tight circle on the flagstones. That's rich. That is truly rich, Charlotte. You think, because you put a plaque on a rock and planted some trees, that you have power? You think this? He gestured violently at the serene space around us. This hobby makes you my equal. It makes me free of you, I said. My pulse was hammering in my neck, but my feet were planted wide-rooted like the oaks outside. And that's something you can't stand, is it? that I survived without your money, that I thrived without your permission. Richard stopped pacing. He turned to me, his face flushing a deep, unhealthy crimson. The mask of the corporate titan was slipping, revealing the terrified small man underneath. You didn't thrive, he spat, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. You scavenged. You took money from my parents' money that should have been mine by rights, and you threw it into the mud. And for what? A tax write-off? A vanity project? Richard, stop, Eleanor whispered. She was still sitting on the bench, her hand resting on the cool bronze letters of her mother-in-law's name. She looked up at him, her eyes rimmed with red, her mascara smudged. Look at it. Just look at it. It's beautiful. It is sentimental rubbish, Richard shouted, his voice cracked, echoing loudly off the stone. Outside the pavilion, heads turned. A couple reading on a nearby lawn sat up. The peaceful hum of the garden was broken. It is a waste of prime equity. He continued, his volume rising with his panic. My father was a pig farmer who died in debt. My mother was a school teacher who never owned a new coat in her life. And you honor them. You use their name to humiliate me. He was losing control. The carefully curated image of the stoic executive was dissolving. He looked wild, sweaty, and pathetic. I didn't do this to humiliate you, Dad, I said quietly. I didn't do it for you at all. That's the part you don't get. You aren't the center of this story. I am the only reason you exist, he screamed. The shout tore through the sanctuary. A flock of sparrows in the canopy took flight, startled by the aggression. Suddenly, a rhythmic swish, swish, swish sound approached from the walkway. It was the sound of stiff bristles against stone. We all turned. Mr. Abernathy was sweeping his way into the pavilion. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. He was wearing his usual attire, a tattered woolen vest over a flannel shirt trousers that had been hemmed by hand, and a flat cap pulled low. He looked like a relic from another era, a piece of the city's history that hadn't been paved over yet. He didn't look up. He just kept sweeping, pushing a small pile of willow leaves closer and closer to where Richard was standing. Swish, swish. You're in the way, Mr. Abernathy grumbled, not breaking his rhythm. Richard blinked, stunned that his tirade had been interrupted by a janitor. He looked down at the old man with sheer incredulity. Excuse me, Richard demanded. Mr. Abernathy stopped sweeping. He leaned on his broom handle with both hands, his knuckles gnarled like tree roots. He lifted his head, revealing eyes that were sharp, clear, and utterly unimpressed by the tailored suit standing before him. I said you're in the way, Abernathy repeated. His voice was gravel and sandpaper. And you're shouting, rule number 1 of the Commons. No shouting. The plants don't like it, and neither do I. Richard drew himself up to his full height, inflating his chest. It was a reflex, a dominance display that worked in boardrooms. Do you know who I am? Richard sneered, looking down his nose at the volunteer. I am Richard Bradley. I am a senior partner at Bradley Holt & Associates. I could buy this entire city block before breakfast. Mr. Abernathy stared at him. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just looked at Richard with a profound, pitying boredom. I don't care who you are, Abernathy said. The words landed with the weight of a gavel. Richard opened his mouth, but Abernathy cut him off. The old man turned his gaze to me. His expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes crinkling into a look of deep protective warmth. But I know who she is, Abernathy said, gesturing to me with a nod of his chin. He looked back at Richard, 3 years ago, my wife died, Martha. We were married 52 years. When she passed, I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. I sat in my apartment waiting to die because I didn't see the point of waking up. The pavilion was deadly silent now. Even Eleanor had stopped crying, watching the old man. Then I found this place. Abernathy continued, his voice quiet but steady. And I found her. She didn't ask me for a resume. She didn't ask for a donation. She put a shovel in my hand and told me that the hydrangeas needed help. He took a step toward Richard, brandishing the broom like a staff of office. She gave me a reason to get up in the morning. She taught me that things can grow back after a hard winter. That woman has the kindest soul in this entire city. She saved my life. She saved half the people in this neighborhood. Abernathy looked at Richard's expensive shoes, then up at his flushed, angry face. You talk about buying the block. Abernathy scoffed. You aren't fit to walk on her mulch. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stood frozen. He had been prepared for an argument about money. He had been prepared for a legal battle. He was not prepared for this, a character witness from a man who had nothing to gain. For the first time in his life, Richard Bradley looked small. The armor of his wealth had been pierced by a truth he couldn't write a check to fix. He looked at me, really looked at me. He saw the way I stood next to Abernathy, not as an employee, but as a protector. He saw the respect in the old man's eyes. He saw the legacy I had built, and he realized with a dawning horror that he was the poorest man in the room. Eleanor let out a long, shuddering breath. She looked from the plaque dedicated to the farm people, to the old man in the tattered vest, and then to her husband, who was trembling with impotent rage. Richard, she said softly, let's go. No, Richard rasped, though the fight was draining out of him. I need to explain to her that. Explain what? Eleanor stood up. She looked frail, but her voice had a new edge to it, the sharpness of someone waking up from a long coma. That we were wrong, that we bet on the wrong things. Look at her, Richard. She doesn't need your explanation, and she certainly doesn't need your money. She walked over to me. She didn't hug me. We were too far gone for that. But she stood close enough that I could smell the gardenia perfume again. This time, however, it didn't smell like power. It smelled like a mask. You look like your grandmother, Eleanor whispered, her eyes searching my face. Around the eyes. I never noticed it before. You never looked, I said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. Eleanor flinched, but she nodded. She turned to Richard. We are leaving, now. Richard looked at me one last time. His mouth opened closed and then tightened into a thin line. He adjusted his cuffs, trying to summon the ghost of his dignity. Fine, he muttered. If you prefer the company of these people, we're leaving. He turned on his heel, but the motion lacked his usual snap. He looked old. He looked tired. Mr. Abernathy watched them turn toward the path, then looked at me. He gave me a quick, sharp wink. I missed a spot over by the ferns, he said, gruffly, creating a pocket of normalcy for me to step into. If you're done entertaining the tourist boss, I could use a hand. I'll be right there, Mr. Abernathy, I said, my voice thick with gratitude. But as I watched my parents walk away, two gray figures against the vibrant green of the life I had built, I knew it wasn't quite over. I saw the security guards approaching from the perimeter, alerted by the shouting. I had a choice to make. I could let them be escorted out like the trespassers they were, or I could show them one last thing. I could show them the difference between being a Bradley and being a gardener. Two security guards dressed in the dark green uniforms of the Commons materialized from the perimeter path. They were moving with the brisk, heavy-footed purpose of men who had heard shouting and were prepared to physically enforce the peace. I knew them both, Mike, a retired firefighter, and David, a gentle giant who usually spent his shifts helping lost tourists find the butterfly house. Today, however, they looked like bouncers. They locked eyes with me, waiting for the signal. "Ms. Bradley," Mike called out, his hand resting on his radio. "We had a noise complaint. Do we need to escort these individuals off the premises?" I looked at my parents. From the back, Richard didn't look like the terrifying patriarch who had ruled my childhood with a checkbook and a gavel. He looked like a small, shrinking man in a suit that was too hot for the weather. His shoulders were hunched, and his stride was uneven, faltering on the gravel I had laid. Eleanor was clutching his arm, not for status but for balance. They looked fragile. They looked like two invasive species that had withered the moment they were removed from their artificial climate. The power of the moment was intoxicating. It sat heavy in my chest, hot and sharp. I could nod. I could flick my wrist, and Mike and David would take them by the elbows. They would be marched out the main gate in front of the afternoon crowd. I could ban them for life. I could humiliate them with the same cold efficiency they had used to discard me 8 years ago. It would be justice. It would be a story I could tell at dinner parties for the rest of my life. But then I looked down at my hands. They were stained with soil, etched with the scars of thorn pricks and wire cuts. These were hands that nurtured. These were hands that understood that you cannot poison the ground to kill a weed without poisoning the flowers you want to keep. If I humiliated them now, if I let my anger dictate the end of this tour, I would be dragging their toxicity into the soil of my sanctuary. I would be letting them change the pH of my life again. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp willow bark and sun-warmed stone. "No, Mike," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Stand down." The guards hesitated, then nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the cypress trees. "Wait," I said to the retreating figures. Richard froze. He didn't turn around, his rigid posture betraying his expectation of a final verbal blow. Eleanor stopped, looking back over her shoulder with wide, fearful eyes. I walked toward them. I didn't rush. I moved with the easy, grounded gait of someone walking on their own land. When I reached them, I didn't look at Richard. I looked at my mother. Up close, the gardenia perfume was struggling to mask the scent of her fear. I saw the fine lines around her mouth, the tremor in her hands. She wasn't a villain. She was just a woman who had bought into a hollow promise of happiness and was now starving inside a golden cage. I reached into the harvest basket slung over my shoulder. It was filled with the morning's clippings, waste to some, medicine to others. I pulled out a bundle of fresh sage, its leaves velvety and silver green tied together with a sprig of English lavender. I held it out to her. "Take this," I said. Eleanor stared at the bundle, then at my face. She looked confused, as if I had handed her a live grenade. "What is it?" she whispered. "Sage and lavender," I said. "Dry it upside down in your kitchen. Make tea with it. It helps with anxiety. It settles the heart." I pressed it into her manicured hands. She took it reflexively, her fingers brushing against the rough stems. "Doctor's orders." I added, my voice devoid of mockery. You came here for healing. You shouldn't leave empty-handed. Richard finally turned. He looked at the herbs in his wife's hand, then up at me. His eyes were searching for the angle, the transaction, the catch. He couldn't comprehend a gift that didn't come with an invoice or a demand. "We don't need your charity," he muttered, though the bite was gone from his voice. "It's not charity, Richard," I said calmly. "It's a yield. The garden produces more than we need. That's how nature works. It's generous." I took a step back, creating a boundary of empty air between us. "You are welcome here," I said, addressing them both with the professional courtesy I would show any difficult donor. "The Commons is a public space. If you need peace, if you need to escape the noise you've built for yourselves, the gates are open. We don't turn people away." I paused, letting my gaze harden just enough to show the steel beneath the softness. "But the rules apply to you too. Respect the quiet, respect the work, and don't step on the wildflowers." Richard opened his mouth, perhaps to defend his dignity one last time, but he found he had nothing left to say. The reality of the afternoon, the plaque, the old man, the success that had bloomed without his permission, had silenced him. He gave a stiff, jerky nod. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a thank you. It was a concession. "Come on, Eleanor," he said, turning away. Eleanor lingered for a second. She lifted the bundle of herbs to her nose and inhaled. For a brief moment, her shoulders dropped. The mask slipped. She looked at me with a profound, tragic sadness. "You really are happy," she said softly. It sounded like an accusation and a benediction all at once. "Yes," I said. "I am." She turned and followed her husband. I stood in the center of the path and watched them go. I watched them walk past the sensory beds, past the koi pond, and out through the wrought iron gates toward the parking lot, where their expensive insulated car waited to take them back to their expensive insulated lives. I waited until the black sedan pulled away, disappearing into the city traffic, before I turned back to the pavilion. Mr. Abernathy was waiting for me by the hydrangeas. He had already cleared the debris from the walkway and was now leaning on his broom, watching me with a knowing expression. "You let 'em off easy, boss," he grunted. "I didn't do it for them, Mr. Abernathy," I said, walking over to him. I knelt down by the hydrangea bush. It was an Annabelle, holding massive white heads of blooms that were starting to brown at the edges. They were heavy, weighing down the branches, threatening to snap the wood if they weren't tended to. I took my shears from my belt. The steel felt cool and familiar in my hand. "I did it for me," I said, positioning the blades around a dead stem. I made the cut. Snip. The dead weight fell away, landing softly on the mulch. The branch, suddenly unburdened, sprang up a few inches, reaching back toward the light. I realized then that I had been carrying the weight of their judgment for 8 years. I had built this entire kingdom to prove them wrong. I had worked until my hands bled to show them that I was worthy. But in the end, their validation was just another dead bloom, dry, brown, and heavy. I didn't need their apology to grow. I didn't need their understanding to flourish. I just needed to sever the connection that was weighing me down. "Sage was a nice touch," Abernathy mused, picking up the debris I had cut. "Think they'll use it?" "Probably not," I said, standing up and wiping the dirt from my knees. "They'll probably throw it away before they get home. It's too messy for a Mercedes." I looked up at the Willow Cathedral, filtering the golden afternoon light onto the plaque that bore my grandparents' names. The air smelled of rain coming in from the west, clean and charged with ozone. But that's not my problem, I said, smiling at the old man. I gave them the seed. Whether they let it grow is up to them. I turned my back on the gate and looked out at the garden, 3 acres of riotous, stubborn, beautiful life in the middle of a concrete city. Come on, Mr. Abernathy, I said, walking deeper into the green. We have work to do. Charlotte proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply growing where you are planted. Have you ever faced similar family judgment? Or had to succeed in spite of those closest to you? Don't be shy. Share your thoughts below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.